All right. I'll let folks, are we still getting people coming in, Ann, or are we good to start?
We are still having folks arriving whenever you feel.
Okay, I'll give people a couple more seconds here just to funnel in. Looks like we're still vigorously adding to the participant list. All right, looks like it's we've stabilized there. I'm sure we'll add some people as we go. But I wanted to welcome people to this fall 2022 digital dialogue series for the Grassland 2.0 project. These digital dialogues have been a big success, and so we're building on them. Want to thank before we even get started, Alex, Stacey Williams, Carl Wepking, and Ann Nardi for their help in pulling this together and advertising the event and pulling together the speakers and the ideas and all that. So there's a lot of people behind the scenes to make something like this happen on a day like today. I appreciate everyone attending. And this fall, we have a topic that's near and dear to me. I think it underlines a lot of my work and my research, and also I think underlines what we do in our Grassland 2.0 learning hubs, which is mainly what I facilitate on a day-to-day basis. So I want to introduce the project a little bit and the learning hubs and the idea of the learning hubs, and then why place and a place-based approach is so important. As many of us on the call know, our current way of doing agriculture here in the Midwest is produces a lot of food, but also produces a lot of environmental harm that I don't think a lot of us are too content with. And so we're left looking for a way to produce food and engage in agriculture in a way that doesn't harm our environment. And these are just a smattering of pictures, but the picture on the bottom left was actually Lake Monona. I was biking home last week, and the lake looked like the Chicago River on St. Patty's Day, which is a scary sight to see. And this is indicative of just one thing. There's a lot of other variables at play here, and also what's not pictured here is in 2020 in Wisconsin we had almost 2 dairy farms a day going out of business. And you could go down the line of a whole host of issues. So there's a real question of how do we get agriculture to work for farmers, work for the environment, and produce food for people. And that's a big thing that we're tasked with here at Grassland 2.0 as a project and working with communities. Knowing the need to work with communities, we've really focused on taking a place-based approach that embraces working in what we call 5 learning hubs. And I have a map of those learning hubs laid out here. 3 of them are in Wisconsin, and we have 2 outside of Wisconsin, 1 in Minnesota in the Pine River, and 1 in East Central Illinois, and my old stomping grounds around Champaign County. And these are some of the pictures of the dialogues that go on with and within the learning hubs. And this is about people coming together who are in a community to identify what they want out of their landscape going forward and how do we get there. And that premise is a very kind of essence of a place-based approach. And so that is a fundamental tenet of the Grassland 2.0 project. So we thought no better way to underscore this than bring in a group of scholars who have focused on place and placemaking as concepts that they work with. And then in the spring, our intention is to have each of the hubs come in for a digital dialogue series and provide a case study of this. So the fall series and the spring series will hopefully build on each other, which is really exciting. So I just want to lay that groundwork for folks who are tuning in to keep that in mind. And I'll make sure to bring that up throughout the rest of this fall digital dialogue series. So that is what we have for setting the stage. I want to then introduce our speaker, who is Dr. Dan Williams, who I've had the great pleasure of working with over the years. Dan is a research postal scientist with the U.S. Forest Service. He did his PhD at the University of Minnesota. We will forgive him for that. But don't worry, Dan, I'm coming from a rival state as well here in Wisconsin. So and then he had a professor position at the University of Utah, Virginia Tech, University of Minnesota, and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he tells me he left because he was sick of the flatland and he heard Bill Stewart was coming to town, so he needed to get out of town. And now he's based out of the Rocky Mountain Research Station out in Colorado. And I first came in touch with Dan's work through my primary advisor, Bill Stewart, who I was just joking about. And I was encouraged to read a lot of Dan's text, which has been very informative, especially Making Sense of Place, Reflections on Pluralism and Positionality in Place Research, which was a 2014 article he wrote, as well as his edited volume on place-based conservation, which he wrote in conjunction with Bill Stewart and Linda Kruger. So I will let Dan get to it and not bore anyone any longer with introductions, but Dan has been a leader in this area, and I'm really excited that he agreed to come talk about this at the Digital Dialogue, and I think y'all will enjoy what he has to say.
Okay, let's see if I can get this up properly. So you're looking at hopefully my screen 2 and not my screen 1, is that right?
Yeah, we're looking at your PowerPoint slide.
Okay, great, great. Well, thanks, John, for that introduction. Yes, I have hung around the Midwest a little bit, but I would say that talking about closing the knowledge practice gap, or the science practice gap, if you like, in the context of sustainable agriculture stretches me at best. My work has primarily been in conservation of forests and natural resources. And so I think what I'm aiming to do here is give you some idea of some of the conceptual terrain with a few examples that come from some of my work related to climate change, and some of it's related to wildfire in particular. And hopefully that sets the stage for this digital dialogue. I mean, it's really kind of an impressive idea that you can get this size of group together to talk about place-based planning and placemaking and such. And this has been my sort of probably my core approach to things in as a social scientist in natural resource management. So let me there we go. Start by, I guess in part I'm setting the context for both my presentation, but it appears I might be setting the context a little bit for this series as well. So hopefully the concepts I provide will help organize both today's conversation, maybe conversations as we go forward. I like to start out with what I call my fish and fire epiphany. I have attended many sort of interdisciplinary, sciencey oriented meetings where our job is to synthesize what we think we know in a way that we think would be useful to managers or practitioners and that sort of thing. And in my experience, these efforts at synthesis tend not to really work all that well. So we sort of continue to have this science practice gap. And I was at one of these meetings called the Fish and Fire meeting, and it sort of just, some of these ideas really struck me while I was participating in this 3-day dialogue. This particular workshop was in Boise, Idaho in about 2007. The problem of the day was what were the impacts of fire on particularly bull trout and in a threatened species that resides in the various streams and the stream network of central Idaho. There you can see in the graphics. And So they brought together, a dozen or two scientists of various sorts, and I was one of the 2 token social scientists. So that's why maybe I did more listening than talking. One of the things that I heard was this idea that bull trout live in this complex, patchy, multi-scale dynamic landscape, and you can see those little patches there, the red and the blue little patches within this complex network of streams. And I also heard about sort of the disciplinary dependent sort of definitions or framings of the problems. So on the one hand, you have the bull trout that need to move around in order to maintain their adaptive dynamics in the gene pool. On the other hand, the more they can move around, the more the aquatic invasive species can also move around and spread into other streams and so forth. And so you find yourself, wow, the solution here depends a lot on how this problem is framed. And the other thing that occurred to me was what particularly the ecologists were saying is that a good prescription, we're often trying to sit down, what is the right prescription for these streams and how does fire affect that prescription? Well, it turns out that no one prescription is ideal because you actually have to have heterogeneity and variety of conditions, because you need to maintain the sort of gene pool so that these fish can adapt over time. And so what occurred to me, first of all, was that, well, this species conservation requires some sort of cross-patch, cross-boundary coordination. And the problem isn't just what is the science, the latest science, but it's also what's going on in my neighbor's patch, what's going on in my patch, what's going to happen in patches down the road. So it sort of framed this as a problem. I would characterize it as a problem of improving practice. And so I sometimes call this the science of practice. And as I've thought about this, I've come to recognize, well, I'm involved in things besides species conservation, where the same sort of problem presents itself: climate adaptation. Certainly the one I'm working on now, wildfire mitigation. Here you can see a little model of how fire spreads across multiple ownerships in this case. I've come across it in terms of water management, where each landowner is trying to get the water off their land as fast as possible so that they don't flood, but then that of course forces all the water into the stream that goes downstream and then makes flood the downstream further worse. Of course, in this case, we want to talk about agricultural systems, and you could even put something like the pandemic in there, where you suddenly realize how all the things that we're doing is so dependent on what's going on in the sort of adjacent neighborhood or landscape or state or country. So from this, my epiphany really was that the science practice gap had at least partly to do with the fact that scientific knowledge actually transformed what might have been formerly seen as a simple problem into a complex and uncertain one. And to use the fish and fire example here, it occurred to me, as these landscape ecologists talked about all the place and scale dependent issues related to prescribing what was good for stream, it occurred to me that in 1910 in the Forest Service, the solution to the wildfire problem was much, much simpler than it is today. And we knew it as the 10 a.m. policy, which is you put the fire out and preferably by 10 a.m. So fire managers didn't see a lot of complexity in their task. They just knew it was difficult to do. So as I said, species conservation needs cross-spatial or boundary coordination. And this requires what I'm calling a science of practice. And that is, it's not just sort of the dissemination and transmission of knowledge, but it's dealing with the informational overload. In fact, the managers on the ground in this fish and fire thing are overloaded with information, some of which is what is going on in the neighboring patch, and not just what is the latest science. And so there's a need to learn from our neighbors, need to learn what's going on nearby and learn together. And that kind of learning can be facilitated by organizing networks of actors, actions, stakeholders, practitioners or whatever. And so to me, this was the reframing that I characterized as my epiphany. And as you start to explore this a little bit more, I mean, there's a what might be called a new philosophy of complexity science, that a lot of our way we've thought about science owes its sort of origins in what might be called Newtonian simplicity, where you just have a few variables interacting in a linear way with each other. But with complexity, what you end up with is actually a plurality of equally or potentially equally legitimate kinds of knowledge and diverse positionalities. And I'll try to explain what I mean by those a little bit more. But what this means for these philosophers of science is that it requires that we change how we conceptualize the world, that is our theories of knowledge and science and so forth, how we investigate the world, our scientific methods, if you like, and then of course, how we act in the world. And that's the problem I was focusing on, is how do we act in a world where we have all of this overabundance of information. So the challenge of acting in an increasingly complex world. Well, it turns out you can go back and find people as far back as 1949 talking about this, and there's a kind of classic paper on complexity by a guy named Warren Weaver, and he talks about 3 classes of problems. The first class is organized simplicity, where there's few objects and they interact in a distinct way. That's the kind of Newtonian way. It's also that organized simplicity diagram on the bottom left there. Then you have disorganized complexity, which is lots of objects, but they're indistinguishable and they interact, and we typically apply statistical and stochastic methods to these sorts of complexities. And then you have organized complexity with many objects, but they're distinguishable in complex interacting ways. There's a lot of emergence that comes from these kinds of problems. So that's partly where the pluralism comes from, is that any one take on these things, you can see different facets of the problem because of all of these sort of emergent patterns over time and just their overall complexity. That produces pluralism. Then I want to also talk about something that geographers talk a lot about, which is positionality. And that's in part recognizing that we as observers, scientific or practical or whatever, just ordinary citizens, sort of are positioned relative to the thing that we're observed. We're in the landscape, if you like, or to use this cartoon from Far Side, you know, we're the psychologist observing behavior through the one-way mirror, except for we've somehow managed to install the one-way mirror backwards. This is kind of a little bit of a play on this idea of our positionality, that we need to understand where we're positioned relative to the thing that we're observing. This occurs to me, or I've in particular been struck by the way in which Allen and Hoekstra, in a book called Toward an Integrated Ecology or something, Unified Ecology or something like that, they describe complexity in social ecological systems, noting that the different facets of ecology, in this case, the different circles there, biome, population, organismic, community, ecosystem, and landscape, and so forth. These different facets of ecology are not so much a matter of nature as a matter of the choices we humans make and how we perceive the world. And in that sense, the subject to sort of the subjectivity of humans that make ecology much more of a soft than a hard science. And so they're basically saying here, there's no one way to perceive the world here as an ecologist. You end up choosing, do you want to look at it through the lens of a biome or a population or a landscape and so forth? And it's very difficult to produce one unified, integrated understanding of the ecosystem in that way, or ecological processes, if you like. So back to the point here, what has place got to do with this? What has place got to do with closing the gap? And maybe closing is even an overly ambitious notion. I was struck by a book written by a guy named Robert Sack that he said in this book, he's a human geographer, place is a fundamental means through which we make sense of the world and through which we act. In other words, it's a fundamental means to the processes of building knowledge and also organizing human action. So let's see if we can sort of take a look closer look at that. So what makes a place? Again, if you ask geographers, they'll come up with 3 or 4 central properties that makes a place something that's other than, say, a resource. One is location. So places are, in relation to one another and in relation to people. So they're located somewhere. In that sense, they have sort of dimensionality and scale and boundaries of those kinds of things. Places obviously contain material form. They have, they're a setting for, say, agriculture, or a locale for an agricultural community. They have buildings and silos and soil and so forth. Then places organize social relations, the relationships between people, whether those are economic or political or perhaps community-based or tribal-based or something like that. They organize social relations. And probably the one that geographers spend the most time on, at least the ones that I deal with, is this idea of meaning and significance, or the idea of sense, identity, and attachment. And when we begin to look at the question of meaning, we can start talking about placemaking in a way here. Let's see. Places or meanings are created through the lived experiences and the material practices of transforming spaces into places. A material practice like sowing seeds or plowing ground or harvesting. They're produced by way of socially and politically and economically interconnected interactions. And I'm going to underscore this word, networks, among people, institutions, and various facets of social ecological systems. And in that regard, they are socially constructed, and as a result, they are continuously unfolding and contested by different individuals and parties. And I won't read the two quotes there, but I think if you've gotten to those, I think they really capture those ideas really well. So placemaking in human geography, if we step back to that four-part definition here, three of those definitions taking location as a given here, we have materiality, social relations, and meaning. And those things sort of converge, if you will, or interact to form places. And this is what Sack refers to. These is the forces that make place. And so the overlap, in a sense, between these things constitute a place in part. But the other idea, and the really critical one, I think, is the role of positionality in placemaking. And I really like this cartoon somebody shared with me a few years ago of somebody looking through their so-called understandoscope there down on a community or a landscape, if you will. And this represents this sort of distant objective view that the scientist ostensibly takes when understanding some phenomenon. But Thomas Nagel, in a book called The View from Nowhere, and that in fact is this idea of the view from nowhere, points out that the challenge for any sort of knowing agent, knowing entity, is how to combine the perspective of a particular person inside the world with this objective view of that same world and the person and his viewpoint included. And so in other words, you can't have the scientists standing completely outside of the system that they're trying to understand. They also ultimately need to understand their own effort to try to understand the system, if you like. But this basically suggests that there are a range of positions that might exist for us to understand a place. And we can think of this kind of view from somewhere versus view from nowhere as kind of the tension between practice, which is always in some context. Practice is always about somewhere, right? Versus science, which tries to take this very abstract, distant view from nowhere that can be generalized from place to place. And so understanding a place involves combining multiple perspectives or these different understandoscopes, and variously positioned between this idea of the intimate embedded view of somewhere, maybe what a particular farmer on a landscape might know, to this more objective view from somewhere remote and abstract, but still somehow doesn't quite capture what the person in the landscape also knows and does and understands. And so we can kind of convert this idea a little bit here into a kind of model, if you like, of multiple positionalities or multiple observers, each looking at a place or a landscape from a particular position. And those positions are informed by, their training, their experience, where they grew up, gender, racial identity, tribal identities, their general different sorts of knowledge, if you like. But anyway, the idea is that everybody brings some background, different background to the problem. And it could be a background just associated with their particular patch of this place, if you like, going back to the idea where we talked about, the fish and fire example. I'm in one patch and I understand what's happening there, but I may not know what's going on in adjacent patches, if you like. So let's apply this idea a little bit to the idea of place-based social learning. This particular photograph is actually a piece of ground in Norway where we were looking at this the problem of how to get stakeholders in this landscape to work together on their water management. So you can imagine these different stakeholders. Okay, this landscape contains these different stakeholders occupying different positions in this landscape, and these different positions constitutes what Kevin Collins here, who I borrowed this from, is a complex adaptive system of diverse agents positioned across different parts of the landscape, if you will, or different contexts, but they can be also different disciplines, different perspectives, different scientific epistemologies, different values, different practices, different geographies, and having varying interdependencies, if you like. So you have these different people all dealing with this complex adaptive system in some way. And this results in these plural points of view, plural values, partial understandings of that landscape. So our challenge is, how do we build a more integrated understanding of landscape? And so the question is, what happens if you network these different stakeholders together such that they're in communication in some way with each other? Well, according to Kevin Collins, this creates what he calls a potential social learning system. And he defines the social learning system as the process of multiple stakeholders socially constructing an issue or problem in which their understandings and practices change so as to transform that situation, hopefully in a way that builds more integrated understanding. So he talks about this as involving the co-creation of knowledge, a convergence of goals, the ability to engage in collective action, and kind of an emergence, if you will, at a systems level, he talks about. So we have this idea then, basically, if we network people together, we're going to get maybe some different kinds of results. And this goes back again to this example, my fish and fire example, where the problem was how to get things such that we knew what was going on in all the adjacent patches in a way that would inform my decisions about my patch. And how do we achieve some kind of heterogeneity in patch dynamics and complexity and resilience, if you like, with all these different actors in this landscape. So one person defined this social learning as a change in understanding that goes beyond the individual to become situated in wider social units or communities of practice through social interactions between actors in a network. This might be better definition than Kevin Collins's definition. But anyway, I think that gets the point across that there are benefits from this greater diversity of actors organized in these multi-scaled, both formal and informal networks. This makes these problems of overcoming sort of information overload more tractable by sharing this geographic context. In other words, because we're in the same place, it sort of allows us to focus on what it is that we have together in this landscape that we can work on, and makes coordination and networking and partnerships, if you like, more possible, or at least simplifies it a little bit from thinking about it as a kind of a distant view from nowhere. And if you think about these networks a little bit, you begin to think, well, you know, the other thing about a network is it's more resilient to change, because as stakeholders come and go, the network has at least the possibility of persisting, and these different roles can be filled over time. So communities of practice then have become a kind of a key notion in this idea of not just place-based practice, but maybe practice more generally. And you see this discussed a lot in what might be called clinical practice fields like medicine, nursing, and even business, where a community of practice, according to Wenger, it's the domain of shared interest and key issues. It's a community in the sense that it develops relationships that are built through some sort of communication, exchange, learning. So you go to professional associations. In the Forest Service, for example, the landscape architects are a very strong community practice. They get together and talk a lot about how to better manage forests with aesthetics in mind, for example. And then there's a body of practice and methods that they share, develop, nurture, and improve over time. So communities of practice are very effective ways to advance certain domains of knowledge where there's a lot of sort of inductive learning and a lot of learning from each other, peer-to-peer, and so forth. And this diagram on the right tries to illustrate some of the differences between a community of practice and other sorts of teams, if you like. On the lower left there, you see highly structured and very goal-oriented work teams. These have strong social ties. They're often deadline driven or performance driven in the sense that they share some sort of performance objective. And then you have what might be called external social networks at the other extreme, which are much more informal, where we have maybe diverse ideas and opinions and weak social ties. And what we're sometimes trying to do is actually sort of engender, if you like, communities of practice, where something in between, where you have this sort of space to test new ideas, develop new knowledge, share and exchange insights. And I think places help this happen, at least in certain respects, when you're dealing with something complex like conservation. So the critical questions then become in improving this ability to work collectively in a landscape or across boundaries would be who shows up in these networks, what are the quality of their relationships, what are their abilities to share, learn, and innovate, and then what sorts of resources and capacities are needed for them to move forward in a more towards a more adapted system, if you like. So with that, why don't I take 10-15 minutes here, and I'm going to talk about a couple of case examples that maybe will help bring this to life a little bit more. The two that I've worked on most in the last 5 or 10 years is one has to do with what we call co-management of fire risk transmission, and the other has to do with climate change adaptation. So I have this project called COMFORT, which stands for the Co-Management of Fire Risk Transmission. And the idea is that, you know, fires move, or risk is transmitted from one landowner, if you like, to another, from Forest Service lands to private lands, from private lands to Forest Service lands, or maybe to somebody's pasture or tree farm or something like that. But to improve then the wildfire governance system, if you like, to one that's the goal anyway, is to more reliably protect the responders, the firefighters, to sustain the communities that are in these fire-prone landscapes, and to conserve the land itself. But this challenge, because fire moves so readily across the landscape, requires this cultivation of relationships and capacities for working or governing across, obviously, jurisdictional boundaries, but we also have landscape scales. The diverse missions and mandates, where, say, the state is trying to protect the trees for harvest, and others are trying to promote some sort of sustainable forestry, or that maybe not quite fair, but some sort of diversity or stand complexity or something. Different organizational cultures. So again, you have just the Forest Service itself as an organizational culture. You might have local fire chiefs have yet a different sort of culture. Their priority, this is maybe a better example of different missions. Fire chief's priority is to protect, obviously, the homes and lives of the people in their fire jurisdiction. Whereas while that might be something that the Forest Service cares about, they also care about the integrity of the landscape itself, and they have this obligation to think long-term about the sustainability of forests and forest ecosystems. And we also have different perceptions of risk. So the first thing you can do actually is map the networks of cross-boundary risk transmission. And some clever GIS people in the Forest Service have done this. And what these little circles, for example, show in this lower left diagram is sort of the amount of acreage that's fire can be transmitted from, say, a private land there in the brown lower right to the sort of green in the upper left. How much risk is transmitted from private to Forest Service land? How much is shifted over to states from Forest Service and so forth? So you have kind of risk transmission network that helps, in a sense, define who the stakeholders are in this landscape and how they're interconnected into the problem. Basically, who sends fire to whom. And so we took these maps, and then we focused on a couple of spots here in North Central Washington and in the Wasatch Front in Utah, for example, to take a closer look. And one of the things that one of the teams that worked on this did is they mapped these networks. And so if you look at the North Central Washington network versus the Northern Utah network, and these networks are basically measure the connectivity between different actors and organizations that engage in wildfire-related management or risk mitigation. And you see first of all, lots of different kinds of stakeholders. Some are, with different agencies, and that different organizations play different roles. Some are more prominent. The bigger the circles, the more prominent, and then the more interconnected they are. So we call these bridgers, people who are particularly prominent in sort of the peer-to-peer learning and moving of information and practice around in a network. And you see some very different patterns. One of the things that's really interesting is these different patterns in different parts of the country are probably related toward the history of how they problem solved in those different places. So in the case of Northern Utah, you get a lot stronger role by state agencies actually in organizing public services and public activities, whereas in the North Central Washington, ironically, it's the NGOs that have played a bigger role in bringing stakeholders together to address these cross-boundary problems. So that's how we mapped these networks in fire risk transmission systems. Another example is how we looked at place-based social learning in climate adaptation. And in this case, what we did is we actually did something called iterative scenario building. And we did this with stakeholders in Big Hole Valley, Montana, which is an agrarian landscape with grazing as the primary mode of making a living there. And so what we did is we asked people basically about how they would adapt to change in the future. And this adaptation, basically, we theorized involves sustaining different collections or assemblages of meanings and practices that constitute particular ways of life or being in this landscape. And so what we did is we presented them with a series of future scenarios about landscape change and the role that climate change would play on that. Of course, some of them are pretty skeptical about climate change, but as ranchers, they're pretty used to dealing with variations in climate, precip, temperature, and so forth from season to season, pretty used to seasonal variations. And so they could imagine these different scenarios in terms of how they might adapt to them. And so basically we used some climate change experts to write verbal descriptions of these different scenarios and describe them in about 400 words in terms of what was going to happen to the landscape about 20 to 30 years out. And then we presented these to stakeholders to get their reactions. And just real quickly, the three scenarios were severe drought, or we called it Some Like It Hot. Then we had sort of the more mild winter, dry summers, which we called Seasons Are Changing. And then we had this feast or famine scenario, which is a very high variability scenario from year to year. And we presented these then to these stakeholders in a series of interviews and focus groups. We started with interviews with individual ranchers and asked them how they would adapt to these different scenarios. We rewrote those scenarios based on their input, so they're very dynamic, and they begin to take in the social consequences of environmental change, and then how that adaptation affects the scenario. And then we did this in focus groups with ranchers and asked them collectively, together, how these scenarios would play out for them. And there was some peer-to-peer learning in that people could then discuss what their different adaptation strategies might be and what the merits or barriers to those might be. And then we did a community-wide deliberation, where in that one we brought in stakeholders who had other livelihoods or who were part of local government or federal agencies, and tried to get them to build a shared scenario, if you like, from that process. And that was a process of discovering what their sort of their common fate, which is a key idea in this idea of networking people together. We have some common fate in the future, and even if we have different sort of priorities, values, livelihoods and stuff, we're in some sense codependent on this landscape, and that common fate provides some kind of strength of unity to work together across our differences, if you like. So in this case, some of the interesting meanings that they surface that define a resilient place in this landscape were the fact that as ranchers and people making a livelihood in this high elevation Big Hole Valley, they had thrived in a harsh environment. They had this sort of moxie or grit were some of the words they used to describe this sort of building their community in this difficult landscape over many generations. So they had this memory of belonging and kind of the settler past that held them together, and the sort of critical notion that the river itself, the Big Hole River, was the lifeblood of the community, and just this in general working the land. So they had these ideas of being a resilient place, but they also surfaced these as potential vulnerable meanings in the face of possible climate change. So this leads to then a set of might be called transformational anxieties that they had, and one was simply the loss of the small family ranches, where the pastoral landscape is initially replaced by the center pivot irrigation. I mean, this pastoral landscape, they use these beaver slides there, which is that picture, lower left picture there, to organize for dry out or whatever. Some of you might know better than me what they're doing with their grass. But anyway, the idea that they would lose this sort of aesthetic, this kind of approach to managing their hay as a, versus the more central pivot irrigation. So that's the first thing. And then eventually that the community would be sort of fragmented and severed around different kinds of identities and different senses of belonging. And the worst case scenario would be even ultimately a shift to amenity home ownership. Seem to lost the O there in ownership for some reason. Amenity home ownership, where the aesthetic changes are things like large homes. They lose access to the river because it's privatized more and more into smaller parcels. And then the whole idea that community membership, at least traditionally identified, is degraded by identities rooted in other narratives and other practices. And it just seems to me this scenario, if you like, is somewhat analogous, I think. It'd be worth exploring in the Grasslands 2.0 idea of what happens when climate changes. What's the viability of agriculture in the old way that we've been doing it, and what is the possibility then of finding adaptations that are more sustainable and resilient? So just concluding about this particular project, we said places are loci for formulating narratives and visions of future adaptation and governance. So this whole process of building a shared understanding of your future is really important. Scenarios then illuminate the linkages between people and particularly places, identities, and the ways in which the different paths they could be in terms of anticipating how they would govern themselves in this landscape. These adaptation trajectories, very interestingly, had very different viabilities, but were limited by, for example, global markets. So a lot of the adaptation space available to them was limited by, for example, the price of beef in the global marketplace. And what is that going to be in 20 or 30 years? So some ways the adaptations are very much connected both locally and globally in terms of what's possible. The hot and dry scenario was seen as the one that basically was the hardest to deal with, and most likely to change the agriculture from the small scale ranching, and that basically the decisions they make are a kind of politics of place. And so they're always negotiating these different politics, if you like, about their future. So just a couple of wrap up slides here, and then we can maybe open it up for discussions. I think my key point really is that one of the things that place gives us is it helps us organize and take advantage of the power of networks, and that there's quite a bit of discussion in complexity science and social complex adaptive systems, dealing with social ecological systems, is the importance of networks. That networks allow us to bring or broaden, if you will, different methods of knowledge and different kinds of knowledge together and integrate them. That the networks, in this case, because they're place-based, can do this in the context of a very specific landscape. And that helps, again, people find that sort of unity of purpose. We share this landscape, we live in this landscape, and can we find ways to thrive in this landscape together? So this emphasizes the idea of collaborative social learning, and that learning is probably best if it includes and sort of co-produces that learning with scientists, stakeholders, and other citizens. And in general, it enhances the attention to place, scale, and context, because as we saw in that first example of fish and fire, the ability to understand what's going on in and around your adjacent landscapes is really important. So a lot of the learning needs to take place in context, and that these networks ultimately then can enhance our resilience because they're learning oriented, and they interconnect people and bring, you know, what all the different stakeholders have to offer to bear on adaptation moving forward. So my general pitch, I guess, is that we need to think more rigorously and more deeply, if you will, about a science of practice, and not just focusing on the practice of science and then trying to deliver that science in consumable bits and in formats that, you know, stakeholders can use. They're actually faced with an overload of information, and so what a science of practice focuses on is how to address the differences that stakeholders bring to the problem, and actually capitalizing on those differences as, you know, forms of local knowledge and insight, rather than treating that kind of knowledge as not relevant. It actually helps bring an understanding to a specific context. And we should recognize and value the local knowledge that stakeholders have, try to surface that knowledge. Places and placemaking promotes this kind of social learning across our differences. And in a sense, then it organizes these communities of practice. It helps bring and interconnect members of, in this case, a landscape community, and helps them refine, learn, expand, and adapt their practices over time, hopefully to be more sustainable. So I'll leave it at that. I can stop sharing my screen, I suppose, if I can figure out where that went. Oh, it's over here now. And I'm opening up for questions, I guess. I don't know, John, are you going to moderate that part?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Appreciate the talk, Dan. As always, it's very enjoyable. It's always awkward too on Zoom, because it usually talks accompanied by a nice round of applause, but I'm sure others are appreciative of the talk as well. Yeah, so if folks want to either leave questions in the chat, or from what I understand, people can unmute themselves. Carl, am I understanding that correct? And just ask the question verbally too. And I guess before you ask a verbal question, maybe use the raise your hand feature, so we just don't have a mad dash of unmuting. All right, Claudio, you're the first with a hand up.
First to the draw. Thank you, Dan. That was fantastic and so relevant to the work that we're doing in Grassland 2.0. I'm going to just ask a kind of nuts and bolts question from an ecologist perspective. At what point, as you're trying to define place through these networks of interactions and bringing people together, at what point does it get too big and diffuse, and to the point where those commonalities, those ways of having conversations kind of falls apart? Is there a limit, like literally a physical space? Is it more of a conceptual limit? How do we think about place in that way?
Well, let me start by saying I think that's a great question. I mean, and it's probably, in general, one of the more difficult questions about sort of the optimal size of a group to do anything, right? And in fact, I read somewhere that somebody said, you know, if you have a homeowners association with you know, more than 50 members, then they just turn it over to the executives and vote, you know. And if you have a homeowners association of 20 members, it's just total conflict. And so, you know, is there a sweet spot where you can work together? And so I don't know that there's a good answer to that question, but I think that the point is that place, you know, helps bring together the most relevant stakeholders in a particular problem or situation, and that in a way that allows them to focus their attention, if you like, on the problem as it manifests in a given context. That isn't to say that there can't be, you know, communities of practice, and there are communities of practice, nationwide communities of practice, international communities of practice for various disciplines and domains and professions and such like that. I think I guess what I'm saying is that, especially when you're dealing with informal communities of practice or stakeholders trying to solve a given problem in a given context, that thinking about these ideas of place and what place does it helps us sort of focus attention so that, you know, stakeholders can say, well, you know, sustainable agriculture is an important problem worldwide, but, you know, I need to focus on what to do here. And so it sort of simplifies the problem a little bit by saying, what does that mean here? And in that sense, you know, because when you're taking action, it's always in place, it's always somewhere. And so it helps us focus on that. But as far as an ideal size goes, I think maybe there's something out there in the literature that I don't know about. It's quite possible, actually. But maybe it's to be investigated. Put that on the list of questions. And it, you know, it kind of coincides with the question of the scale of place. So, you know, in this sense, then, you know, when we map networks, for example, in Washington and in Utah, I mean, you find the local actors, but they eventually say, oh, I'm connected to so-and-so in another place or at a national scale. So the way these networks are built, and I didn't say this, is that basically you do chain referral. You interview some people who are active in the thing, and then you say, who else do you interact with? And then you go interview them, and you ask, who else do you interact with? And then you eventually build up this sort of hairball diagram of who interacts with whom. And so those are, you know, to some degree, whatever your area of interest is, then your network can be scaled to that area of interest, but there'll always be connections outside of that. So I don't know if that's a very satisfying answer, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Dina, I see your hand up. Before people ask questions, too, if you just give a quick introduction, just a quick who you are, just so Dan has some idea who's asking the question.
Sure. Thanks so much, Dan. This is Adina Rissman. I'm a faculty member here at UW-Madison in the Social Sciences and Policy. And it's been a number of years since I've seen you at a conference, so it's great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. And very, very apropos of the work that we're doing here. I found this really rich intellectual journey as well as very practical, and I love that focus on the science of practice. My question for you, in the context of some of the work that we're doing here in the Midwest, grazing and the use of pasture for livestock, as well as the large history of grasslands and prairies, is very old, and yet has largely in many places been replaced by corn and soybean production. And so this effort is something to try to maintain what we have, as well as restore some of that grassland and pasture. There are different, somewhat competing, somewhat overlapping visions of place and what agriculture can be here. And hopefully people will chime in thinking about that question. I'm curious how you've dealt with these maybe different competing visions in really recognizing and taking seriously that sense of pluralism, or the fact that, you know, people have different perspectives and values. You know, one of the things that's really struck me being involved in scenario processes over time is that they're really not, they don't follow the same logic as a behavior change campaign. You know, we're not directing attention to changing specific things. We're actually growing the uncertainty. You know, we're inviting people to really tangle with these different potentialities in ways that that can be confusing for people, or can kind of complicate a simple behavior change campaign. So I guess I'm curious about a couple of things. One is, have you evaluated the scenario work to see how it leads to, you kind of ended like, and hopefully they adopt more sustainable practices, but I'm curious if that's something that you've tried to evaluate. And then also, you know, what has been your process for addressing different visions and including everybody? You know, you mentioned first maybe individuals of similar groups and then bringing them together, but, you know, thinking through that process.
Wow, great questions. I guess my mind is going in several different directions. I haven't done a lot of sort of follow-up evaluation. It just suddenly pops into my head, though, that in the Caldor fire last year burned through one of the communities that I studied some 10 years ago. And there's been some discussion and some chatter with my colleagues that worked on that project that we should go back in there and find out what happened. So and then the other thing I'd say about the climate change stuff is that in fact it's, because it's such a long process, that we're talking about the future, often it's very hard to see what those things are in a short term. So they're more like, they help us think through these situations, but the question of to what extent these practices have been sort of developed and institutionalized, I think still remains to be seen. And I think in your question about behavior change, I mean, that to me sort of is the crux of how much our institutions, this is what I talk about a lot in my fire stuff with the agency. So beware if you're recording this that I might say something not kosher to the agency's point of view, but it is that can I say this, that the Forest Service is a vegetation management agency, so every problem is a vegetation management problem. And so the solution to the vegetation management problem, in addition to treating the vegetation when it comes to people, is some sort of communication, persuasion, information campaign to get them to do something different than what they've done. And as a social scientist, I'm very skeptical of the power of those kind of campaigns. And I could have gotten into some of the work by Jonathan Haidt, for example. He talks about that we don't make decisions on a rational basis very much, and that emotions rule rather than rational thought. And so one of the big barriers to I think moving to this complex system view, and you alluded to this as well, is that these complex systems have lots of uncertainties, lots of moving parts, if you like, lots of different disciplinary takes. So no one discipline can get leverage on the problem by itself. So the fish and fire problem ignored all of the other land uses that are going on in that landscape, to simplify it down to something we could talk about. And so that's where I think place is powerful, because it allows us to talk about all the things that are relevant to this landscape, and not necessarily have to worry about, all kinds of complexity. I'm not sure I'm being very clear there, but that we're more likely to surface what those critical other pieces of the landscape are in this context if we focus on the place and bringing the diversity of stakeholders together who have knowledge and experience managing those different things. So see, it seems like there's two parts to your question, and I'm not sure I really hit both of them, but maybe you could redirect me a little bit.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your talking about behavior change and kind of skepticism about the agency-driven campaign there. And then I think the other is, what do you do when there's competing visions of place? Your context, do you bring in, do you have the group of the realtors and the housing groups, as well as the farmers, and kind of how do you address that?
Well, I think one I would say is that as an agency, so you put your scientist hat on or your agency hat on in this case, and say, as a scientist, it's for the people to resolve those differences, right? It's not for me to sort out, but that is, I guess, what I would say is the sort of, that in a sense, all problems are political. All of these solutions are all political solutions. And so there is no technical way out of this dilemma. It's kind of what I would turn that back to and say, it's balancing, it's struggling. There may be sort of locally optimal solutions, so to speak, but they're only conditional. They're only in the moment optimal or whatever, So I guess what I'm trying to say is that people have to come together and work out their differences. And the challenge there is that if I were to step back and say, what does citizenship mean? It means willing to listen to your neighbor in part and work together. It doesn't mean you have to agree on everything, but you have to be sort of good faith in that process. And if we lose that, and we can have a political commentary about where that's going, if we lose our ability to be willing to hear listen across our differences, then we can't solve these problems. So, you know, maybe we should be focusing less on an information campaign and more on what does it mean to be a good citizen in a complex, pluralistic world, society, community, or whatever. And what are the obligations that go with that? So again, that's not a very satisfying solution, but it's to say that the solution is political and not really in our hands. We hopefully can shed some light on what sort of processes, social processes, might nurture better outcomes.
Okay,
Tough questions, you guys.
I see a comment in here that Jeanette, I hope I'm saying your name properly, left. And this is actually pretty poignant because I think, Dan, when we were setting up or discussing this was a topic we brought up. But, Jeanette, I don't know if you want to raise that question or if you want me to read it. I'll give you a second to unmute if you want to ask.
Hi, this is Jeanette with US EPA Region 5 in Chicago. And I just noted in the chat, because I do a lot of tribal work, that this discussion or the framing you had is occurring in the context of traditional and indigenous ecological knowledge. And how do you make sure that those considerations are made as you're doing environmental science? So very relevant to that discussion.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I did see it in there, and I didn't emphasize that enough. But when I use this view from nowhere, from somewhere metaphor, whatever it is, you know, it's to say in part that there's always local knowledge in the landscape in a place, but it can also be local in a culture. And the idea being that there are many knowledges, if you like, and one of the challenges is bridging these different knowledges as we make decisions and go about, you know, trying to arrive at solutions to these kinds of problems. So yeah, there's a strong connection to traditional indigenous knowledge. Sometimes, you know, people would talk about, you know, traditional ecological knowledge. It could be any kind of knowledge, though. It doesn't have to be ecological. And in fact, it could be, somebody called it vernacular knowledge. There's knowledge about local things that only local people have, but that is relevant to the decision. So there's always some level of local knowledge, and our challenge then in making decisions and guiding the governance or management of a landscape is integrating all these different kinds of knowledge. And so I would hope that by thinking about place-based practice, that we are recognizing indigenous knowledge, and then you know, in order to do that effectively, those people who hold that knowledge have to be at the table. And one of the challenges there sometimes is that indigenous people may have knowledge. There's lots of challenges, but one of them is may have knowledge, but even of that landscape, but aren't necessarily considered, you know, it's not their tribal land or something like that. So tribal knowledge, indigenous knowledge transcends, you know, sort of contemporary political jurisdictions. And so how do we bring that knowledge into it? We should be finding ways to do that. Yeah, I think that's a really important question. Yeah.
It looks like Sarah Strassman has the next question.
Well, I saw Tom was trying to get it in there on an earlier one, so I don't want to cut him off if he's got a follow up on a similar vein. Yeah.
Okay, Tom, I'll let you fire away then. I don't want any feuding over the question.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Tom.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I had a little problem with that hand thing. It seems like every time I use Zoom, it's configured a little bit differently. So anyways, I'm a retired agricultural economist, and you made the comment about a Jonathan Haidt, I think,
Yeah.
who said that people make a lot of their decisions emotionally, etc. And of course, that doesn't surprise me because I think I've observed that many times as an ag economist, that people often make business decisions based on emotion rather than based on information, etc. And of course, that's quite contrary to one of the core principles of economics, which are people are all rational at all times and are profit motivated. And at least in my experience, they're seldom motivated in that way. And so I was interested in I guess finding that I've never heard of Jonathan Haidt before, and so I'd be interested in seeing that reference to back up some of the claims that I've made.
Okay.
And of course, you know, the concept of behavioral economics is relatively new in the last 20 years, in which the economic.
I think we lost Tom.
What?
Dan, can you hear him?
Yeah, I'm hearing him.
Well, the economics profession is slowly gravitating toward behavioral economics, in which we acknowledge that all humans are not totally rational at all times. And of course, by acknowledging that humans aren't rational at all times helps us better explain the economic world and economic decisions, etc.
Yeah, I put a quick reference to it off the top of my head in the chat there, Jonathan Haidt. I think I spelled his name correct. And it's a, I think, 2012 book called The Righteous Mind. And I think it's a subtitle like Why Good People Disagree About Politics and Religion or something like that. And so, yeah, I think within social psychology, he's a social psychologist or maybe a political psychologist, that there's the idea that in fact, people rarely behave in the way sort of neoclassical economics would suggest they're supposed to, at least. So there's sort of a gap between what we say they ought to do and what in fact they do. And he makes quite a point of this in terms of all the ways in which people rationalize or justify their sort of pre-established positions. And it's just, I think, one of a line of research in social psychology that suggests that getting people to think in this sort of rational way is really difficult, and kind of leads to this view that trying to change minds is maybe at best a fool's errand. And people do change their minds eventually under maybe extreme circumstances, but not easily, and certainly not about things that they sort of develop a kind of emotional commitment to. So yeah, I think that goes back to the earlier questions about behavior change. That it's very difficult. Anyway, it's a great book. He cites lots of examples of how people fail to heed what might be considered rational or hold to their views despite contrary evidence. So maybe it speaks to the moment a little bit too, I think.
Just a follow-up comment. Probably 40 years ago, there was some research at Cornell University in which they concluded that farmers were the main driver for farmers adapting practices was convenience as opposed to anything else. In other words, if it made the work easier, faster, etc., that was a big motivator, more so than anything else, and that fits along this same thought process.
Yeah, and these patterns develop early, and then your commitments to them, become difficult to change. And I think, one of the other things that's sort of in this vein is sort of the cognitive demands of change. That is, that it's a lot easier to just kind of continue what you've done before than it is to, stop and think through and try to, come to a different practice if it requires a lot of effort. And so people will tend not to do that, I suppose. I don't know a lot about farmers in particular, but at least these are the points that people like Jonathan Haidt and somebody else has brought up, Rachel Kaplan and some others, that there's sort of this notion, there was a notion of a rational actor that drove a lot of, I would sort of say, the same kind of science that that I called Newtonian science earlier, the sort of science of simplicity, just a few variables. We thought people would be rational and that if you gave them the information, they would behave differently. But as we look at these complex phenomena, we realize that there are a lot of other things going on that shape how people adopt practices. And so our sort of expose them to information strategy is insufficient at best, I guess.
And of course, as an ag economist, as I talk to people, I often hear them say that they're making a choice because it's more profitable or economically superior. And maybe I hear that because they think that's what I want to hear. But usually they don't fool me, because if I'm analyzing the situation, I can tell that the choice they made didn't enhance their profitability.
Yeah. It also occurs to me that the systems that we've built up for managing things around this sort of rational actor and sort of utilitarianism and sort of Newtonian simplicity, you know, they're good at optimizing one or a few variables. But if you put all of your eggs in the optimization basket, you risk the resilience basket. And so there's a bit of trade-off between sort of constantly optimizing around one or two key outcomes and developing resilience. And so most of our management systems and our tools and our training really teach us how to organize around optimization rather than resilience. And the problem in part with resilience is it's a property of a system, you know, and so it has many parts, and it's hard for any one actor then to sort of to optimize you know, resilience, because the resilience is the collective property of a lot of people doing things rather than the outcome of one person doing something.
I'm
Good point.
Yeah. I'm sensitive to time here. I want to make sure we get to Sarah's question. One other thing that Tom's question made me think of here is if there's any people who want any of the references or anything from Dan's presentation, I can make sure to circle back with Dan and get those in your hands. So if there's any open points that you have on that or things you want to read, please shoot me an email. Sarah, I'll let you fire away with the question. Ooh. Did you put your hand down or did I?
Yeah, I just did because I realized it was up for an obnoxiously long time. Thoughtful presentation. I'm from Trout Unlimited in the Driftless area, the 4 states, the corners of the 4 states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa. And a lot of folks kind of covered this, you know, and I think your last point in particular about the challenge of, you know, defining resiliency inside of a social and economic culture that typically has been about kind of optimizing and believing in certain economic efficiencies that require human behaviors that aren't really what we see a lot of the time on the landscape. But I guess mine goes back a little bit to probing your discussion with farmers in the Big Hole Valley and looking at kind of what they identified, these transformational anxieties. I wonder, you know, I read those things and I think a little bit about kind of how time bound those are to the particular generations who are there right now in this moment with land management roles or own land, and that, you know, that has some obvious gaps to who could or could not become those landowners, and you know, who else has knowledge of that landscape, and what other social models might exist. So I don't know how you grapple with that other than you know, as you've tried to describe, it's a social problem of who we invite to the table and how we deliberate on these issues with, you know, our fellow citizens. But I don't know, maybe take a crack at it.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, you raise, I think, some important limitations of what we did there. So we took the system as it is, we took the system for granted as it is. Okay, these are the stakeholders in this system, and in their pride of place and all that, they talk about, all these sort of what might be called sort of settler colonial ideas that, there were people in that landscape before they were there. And so in dialogue with them, it reproduces, I guess, the social system to a certain extent as it is. If that's, I think, partly where at least your line of thought was taking me, is that it was, what we were trying to do there was just explore how people dealt with scenarios. It wasn't necessarily to solve the problem in that particular landscape. And so we, for convenience, chose, I think, 4 different groups of stakeholders. The ranchers were just one of them that we looked at. We did a similar thing in Grand County, Colorado, where we also had ranchers, but we had people that are very tied to for example, the ski resort industry in the high mountains of Colorado, and different kinds of water users. And what you see is this idea of shared fate that they all have in that future. But there's already people who aren't sort of on in the dialogue. And so, for example, Native peoples who once occupied these lands, for the most part, weren't included in our investigation, but perhaps should have. But again, we weren't trying to solve the problem here. We weren't creating a solution, or we're creating a process like planners trying to go in and help the community move forward. We were actually doing research. So I can use that as the dodge, right? We didn't include some stakeholders we might have included had we done a more a sort of extensive study of that particular landscape. So anyway, that's what gets me thinking about it. And I do think that the other thought there is that, the stakeholders who were willing to explore their shared fate, some of that took them, to places they didn't want to be, like losing their small scale farming or ranching. But the other side of the coin in all of this is, the climate changes, the world changes is, inevitable. And sometimes we're, I guess it's where's the balance between essentially these people finding a path, a more resilient path forward in their landscape, versus sort of recognizing that there'll be loss of some kind or other, cultural loss, economic loss, loss of identity. And that's been going on for generations and eons in some sense. So we want to be more adaptive, but there may be limits at times to our adaptedness. And we've probably already excluded some people from the discussion. Again, not a very satisfying answer, I don't think, but a political one maybe, that there's a certain amount of politics that still exists around these choices.
It looks like Alan, and this has a question here, and this is probably going to need to be the last question, just time-wise. So, Alan, I don't know if you want to ask that. I'll give you a chance to get off mute.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I'm Alan Krause. I'm a conservation program manager here for a small nonprofit located in Northfield, Minnesota. We work a lot with farmers on building resilience in the watershed. And I've spent a lot of time working with farmers on cover crops and reduced tillage and the sort. And when I found your conversation fascinating, I got a page and a half of notes that I've taken here. Really great discussion. But it struck me though, one of the questions that sort of pinned it a little bit was the size of the network. I've had farmers tell me that, anytime they get beyond 6, 7, or 8 farmers in this small group of collective talking about shared practices and what they're learning, and maybe even sharing resources to purchase cover crop seed, for example, things get pretty skewed out quickly. So keeping the group sort of small has been effective for folks. but it also struck me that, and I think when you mentioned you're not very, you don't think information sharing as a campaign would be very effective, but if individual growers, and I stress this to growers all the time, if they strive to find resilience in their own farming business, and really focus on what they can best do, for their own future, and set a longer time frame, a planning horizon that exceeds a year, for example, right? That they're bettering themselves and the resilience of their farm and the resilience of their farm business, and in effect, building the resilience of the community and the resilience of place. And I totally agree. Networking and sharing a vision is fantastic and awesome and very effective. But I don't know if I fully agree that sharing information on an individual basis, an information campaign, cannot be that effective. But and I'll let you comment on that.
Yeah, well, I think you raised some key points here that I think maybe there's some nuance to them, and one is when I'm talking about information campaigns, generally it's from expert to out to the actors, the farmers, the ranchers, or whomever, when you're trying to get them to adopt a particular practice, or it could be to stop smoking, or any number of kinds of things like that, that those tend not to be very effective. I do think information sharing, however, is a little bit different in my way of thinking about this, and that is that in fact you're trying to network people together so they can share local information, and part of it is information about what each other is doing. And so in that way, it's not like some information campaign that's being pushed out from the top, but actually us collaborating, working together, learning from each other. So that's maybe a different kind of information sharing than that I think we would agree would be very valuable. I guess the question of at what scale is something resilient? I think you're right that sure, that at a certain scale, my farm I could do that's maybe more resilient. But I think one of the challenges that we saw in the fish and fire example is that resilience at some level needs to be understood at a higher level, at a higher scale. Because while I may have good habitat for bull trout here, if everybody achieved the same good habitat using the same methods, we would actually maybe have less heterogeneity of habitat as a result, and that in one sense is bad. So how do you create resilience at sort of multiple scales is by networking people together, and then understanding that our goal isn't necessarily to reproduce exactly what each other's doing, but to understand resilience a little bit at a larger level. And to me, this is where federal agencies like the Forest Service or USDA writ large would shine, is because they can have the information systems that observe, say, these larger watersheds or these larger spaces, and can identify whether or not habitat, in the case of bull trout, is collectively getting better or collectively getting worse, and then provide that information back to those individual landowners or land managers and say, this landscape is collectively is not moving where we think it needs to go to be more resilient. And so, but you leave it to the individual actors in the landscape to figure out through coordination and interaction in their network of how to rectify that situation, collect it both individually and collectively, I guess. So I just think there's a complicated scale or dimension to this problem of resilience, and we have to be able to think about resilience at more than just the individual actors level. Nonetheless, it is important to get people to manage their lands in a more resilient way. I guess I would agree with that. So I don't know if that quite addresses your question, but
well, I'll only just follow up and say that
okay.
That was just an excellent answer. Very okay. Well received.
Thanks.
I fully agree with your response on it. Very well done. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. I got myself out of trouble. Thanks.
We'll have more hardball questions after this, Dan, where we won't give you feedback. I appreciate everyone's thoughtful questions, and Dan, I appreciate a very thoughtful presentation. I know when we were setting it up, I kind of admitted this would be a tricky presentation to tie in the context from the Rocky Mountains to us here in the Midwest, and navigating place, which is as a fellow place scholar, I think is an admittedly confusing and nuanced concept that can be easily lost on people. So I appreciate you distilling that and allowing for a fruitful discussion here today. And I think it was a fabulous kickoff to this seminar series, or this dialogue series. And there will be another speaker to follow up on Dan, Dr. Elena Bennett, who Carl Wepking and I are going to be meeting with in 5 minutes to talk about her talk. So onward marching. And Carl, do we have a date for that yet? Or I just want, while people are here, we can put it on there.
Yeah, it's going to be 2 weeks from today. Is that, I think that's October 18th at the same time.
Yep. Okay, so October 18th will be the next talk, and we'll be sending out emails and stuff to remind folks in the normal place. But appreciate it, and appreciate the talk, Dan, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you very much. Appreciate all the great questions. You guys kept me on my toes, that's for sure. So thanks. Thanks again. It certainly helps me understand how this applies as well to your situation. So I've learned a lot in this process.
And
Thanks.
if there's more follow-up, either email me, or I also put in Dan's bio into the chat too, so you could email Dan directly too. So appreciate it.
Okay, and I'll get you a list of references at some point too.
Okay, sounds good.
Great.
We'll stay in
All right.
touch. All
Thank you very much.
Have a good
Bye.
rest of the week. All right, bye.